right. Let's get this. 5:23 is where we're starting today. And let's get started with a prayer. Father God, we thank you for another day that we've been blessed with, for the chance to gather here. Whether the time changes or not, we know that you don't change, and we're grateful for that and for all that you've blessed us with. Help us, Father, to continue to seek and do your will, and in Christ we pray. Amen. As I was getting this week ready, I realized I'm running out of Old Testament very quickly, which might sound weird only being in David, but it's like, now we're talking about places that we've already talked about, so I don't really see a lot of value in revisiting them. So I'm kind of going to shift a little bit after David towards largely the in-between period of when the Old Testament ends and when the New Testament begins, to just see the history of what's happening in the world and how it influences the Jewish people and later Christians. So, okay, maybe I won't do that. Well, I'll do an overview. He'll do a detail thing because. Yeah. Well, the other thing I want to do is a couple special topics of just like pick up threads that were very hard to follow. Like I talked a little bit about the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to talk more about it this week. But I thought that might make a good week is to just kind of follow where the Ark of the Covenant went. So we'll have some fun with that. And then the New Testament is ahead. I wanted to go back to Jerusalem. Obviously, I spent a lot of time on it last week. But as I thought about it, I realized I didn't have a map that explained how Jerusalem expanded. So what does David actually take? David, this is called the Old City now, but like David's only taking a small little piece of what we would call Jerusalem right now because it just wasn't as big of a city in his time. He builds it up. He conquers it, he starts building it up into a Jewish city, and it starts expanding because it's a capital city. Capital cities have a way of getting larger. I don't think, well, when they built Washington, D.C., there weren't even probably 1,000 people that lived there. It was swampland. So very low residency when they built it. Kind of built up over time. Even Tallahassee, which is small as far as capitals go, it's built up a lot over time. So this is the same thing that's happened to Jerusalem. So in David, it's pretty small. It sees a very big expansion under King Solomon. Solomon's got more time. He's doing those big construction projects that we read about in the Bible. He builds the temple, he builds his palace. These things take years. He's building up an entire city here. And then it's got another major expansion under King Hezekiah, and it becomes a lot more resembling of what we know as Jerusalem now. And then even now, which is not on this map, but it's one we had last week, is the modern expansion of Jerusalem as the Israelites returned there post-World War II. So this kind of puts modern U.S. in more perspective, and this cut off a lot more than I expected. So the blue section is predominantly Jewish. This is what the Israelites are in full control of. And you can see it's not just one blob. It's got these scattered places throughout. One of the reasons that will happen is in not everything has been a question of fighting here. Sometimes what's going on is Jewish people would buy homes and land from Palestinians. And that would be a way of expanding Jewish territory. This is something that's happened for generations. Now, in modern terms, they won't sell. Palestinians will not sell to Jewish people. So that you can't do that anymore. So they'll sometimes buy through intermediaries. They'll make it look like somebody else is buying the land. But that's how you can get these scattered footprints very easily. But also some of that was just population, that the Jews were actually over here before the Palestinians were over here. which sounds weird, but it did actually happen because they weren't very predominantly in Jerusalem until after they started coming in here. So the Old City is this tiny little section here. So back when we're looking at this present Old City, you can kind of see that shape. And you can kind of see that shape. So it's a pretty small little region when you're talking about the Old City. And I wasn't sure I put that in full context last week, and I thought it was a point worth going back to. So if you were talking about something like the temple, you'd be talking in this area of Jerusalem. Now the Western Wall. The U.S. Embassy for generations was in Tel Aviv under the not under the Bush administration. Under the first Trump administration, he did move the U.S. Embassy. It is now in Jerusalem. So that is in there. This was a UN kind of neutral zone for a while. They were trying to make this a joint city, which they're still trying to do. That's questionable. And then the 1949 line is here. So the 6 Day War, it's got the line where those borders were set. And of course, these things are all disputed today. But I thought that put Jerusalem in a little better context. So now I wanted to take a moment and kind of talk about what's going on in the world. Like these events in the Bible are happening contemporaneous to other things. Now, those other things aren't necessarily very global in scale, so they aren't things we initially think of. To the extent that there's major states in the world, other nations out there that are big, they tend to be extremely regional. They're not traveling a lot. Even with the Israelites, we've seen that. You know, we've seen basically no interaction with Egypt at this point, and Egypt's pretty close. They've only been dealing with the people who were right around them. So, what's going on elsewise in the world? In the time of David, we're talking about around the 10th century BC. Now, again, you're going to have different theories on when exactly these things are. There's various ways these things can be measured. But in the time of 1st to 2nd Samuel, you're talking that this is what China would look like. So you think about how big China is, and that I don't even know that that's a quarter of the mass. But this would be the Zhao dynasty. So China isn't China yet when we're talking about what's going on in the book of Samuel. And that's about as big a thing as I saw as I was looking at it. Assyria. The Assyrian Empire is going to be very pivotal on what happens in history, and it's going to be very influential on what happens in Israel. They're not going to be an empire yet for another 100 years, much less dealing with Israel. They're not going to be the Assyrian Empire for 100 years. The Zhao dynasty here that I put on the map, this is the longest dynasty in China. Dynasty means ruling family. So this line of rulers, this was the longest one they had as far as the emperors go. Also contemporaneous to Samuel, you're talking about the earliest Arabic writings that they have currently. So going back to the 10th century BC, this is the oldest stuff they can find written down as far as the Arabic language goes. There are stories that are older than that for sure, but in terms of what somebody could put their hands on, find, this is a writing that they found going back this far. And also somewhat contemporaneously, you have the Trojan Wars in 1020 BC. So, very famous, the whole big horse and everything. So you start talking about there are very significant events happening around the world at this time, and this is the time where nations are really starting to form and become more than just individual city kingdoms. There are a lot of nomadic people still on the world. The European continent is much less organized. In the Mediterranean, trade is active. Like, they would know this area of the world very well. People are running ships across the way. They might have more grain down here that they want to bring up to Europe. They have spices that will trade across the various ways. So there is very active trade, but usually what will happen with that is it's kind of coastal ships. So I don't know how many experienced boaters we have, but there's a big difference between being a mile or two offshore and trying to be way out here, right? Um, just as an anecdote, I thought this was funny. England is kind of mythical to the world at this point. Like, obviously, it's off this map. England would be way over here. But there's people who trade with England, or Britannia, as they might know it at this point. So there's people who know it exists and have been there. But when you're all the way over here, it's kind of this mythic, faraway place. You're not really sure if this is a real thing or if people are just telling you stories about this thing. And that's kind of the status it's in until Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, they kind of better established the fact because he goes to Britain. That's when the Roman world really gets its mind around the fact that it's there. It's a whole people over there. And this map just kind of has a lot of the tribes that are on here. It's just labeled where they were. And it kind of illustrates the point that much of this is not as organized as you might think it is. But that also tracks perfectly with what we're seeing in Samuel, because we've seen through the judges that Israel was not very organized as a nation yet. And they want to change in that because that change offers them a lot more security from the world that's around them. In the 12th century BC is the Bronze Age collapse. So this is several of the major nations that are around the Mediterranean collapse in a pretty quick time span here. So Egypt, Anatolia, the Aegean, Eastern Libya, and the Balkans all have basically nations that fail at this point in time. Mycenaean Greece collapses. So you've heard of ancient Greece, probably. Mycenaean Greece is even before ancient Greece. So this is old Greece that we're talking about. Their state was part of the Bronze Age collapse. Uh, they did early estimates of something like 100 cities that collapsed in the early Bronze Age. Now, that number has been redacted. Basically, as people studied it more, got a better picture of history, found more records, they said, okay, it wasn't that high. But it's still a lot of cities that collapsed in a very similar time frame. And well, that's something that historians argue about. But a big part of it is the Bronze Age part. The metal is changing over time. So we go from bronze, we get Iron Age. I think tin was before bronze. So the compositions of metal involve the strength of weapons themselves, which that's not this slide, that's on another slide. Okay, I've got a slide that's out of order, and I'll just have to deal with that later. There's this little verse that says when the Israelites went to battle, that only Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in their hand. That verse is, I quoted it later in here. I just put it in the wrong place in my slides because it should be here. That probably means the metal that they're working with, that like only Saul had an advanced sword. Saul had one that was like had iron in it instead of being bronze or tin, something like that. He had a stronger metal sword, a more modern one, because the Philistines had kept advanced blacksmithing out of Israel, because that was one of the ways you were going to keep them as servants to you, is you were going to keep the stronger weapons and not let them arm up. So metalworking changed. There were the sea people are another major theory because they were basically Vikings before there were Vikings. So they're going around the Mediterranean and they're taking whatever they want. may also have had an influence on the Philistines. Then the Philistines, that may have been, they were getting crushed on two sides between the Israelites. Some of the people in the Philistines may have been from the Sea People because there's seems to be multiple cultures involved. That was something I looked at over time. So that and food. Food's always going to be a big one. Anytime states fail, there's a shortage of food. So when you start having people raiding your lands and burning stuff down, it starts causing food shortages, and that's an easy way to collapse a society is to not have food. All right, back to the Bible. Not Samuel, Samuel has already passed quite a while ago. King Saul has fallen in battle. We talked a little bit about who's going to follow up with him because all of the first generation heirs are gone. Jonathan, his brothers, they're all gone. The only one we know that survived is his daughter, who is technically married to David, although they haven't seen each other in probably years at this point. I didn't stop to get a good timeline on that because I just thought that's an interesting point. But she helped David escape her father, and David's been on the run for years at this point, so we don't know when the last time these two actually saw each other was. Jonathan did go visit David at one point, but she didn't go with Jonathan to go see her husband. She stayed back in the capital. So we don't see them interact again until David returns. All right. So 2 Samuel 5. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up with full force to search for him. But David had heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread in the valley of Rephaim, so David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" And the Lord answered him, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. And he said, "As the water breaks out, so the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal Perazim. I'm not going to pronounce anything right. I'm just trying to get close. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. So we get a clear picture. David is king. He was brought in. The tribe of Judah started talking about making him king. Then David sends a message to the Israelite tribes and said, "Hey, do you want me to just be king down here? Do you want me to be king in everywhere?" And they all say, "Yeah, David will be our king." So the entirety of the nation establishes that David's going to be king. The Philistines hear about that. They obviously know David. David was just over there. So he's very well known. And now they have a very real threat that they're worried about, and they've picked a fight over it. And we see down in verse 22, "Once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the land of the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, 'Do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching at the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army.' So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer." So this is very notably moving west. Israel had started up towards the Jordan River. They'd moved through the mountains. They were pretty populated there. The Philistines were down in the plains. We're seeing Israel move from the mountains to the plains, fighting the Philistines. This is an expansion of Israel. David and his men know this land pretty well. We talked about this. He traveled from Israel over to Gath, the capital city for the Philistines. He'd moved to the south. They had brought him all the way up as part of the war party that was going to fight Saul, and then he went back again. His men know what this terrain is like. They know what's where. They've got a very good sense of this area, maybe better than anyone else in Israel. The Philistines' first attack is the southern point here that I've got with the arrow. That's near Hebron. And then the second attack they're doing is up further north, and that's near Gibeon. Um, oh, here's where I put the other slide. Yep. So when David is doing this fight, his men may be better armed than Saul's men were. And this was the verse that I was saying. I knew I had it in here somewhere. This was in 1 Samuel 13, verse 22. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. That doesn't mean they had no arms. That doesn't mean they were fighting with sticks here, but that means they didn't have the advanced weapons. But David's got a war party. He's got people who are ready to fight, who have spent the better part of a generation learning how to fight. So he has much better success in the battle than Saul does. Speaking of the ark, in chapter 6, David again brought together all of the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up the ark of the God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of the God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzziah and also Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart. So remember, the Philistines had captured the ark, and then when everybody started dying to disease, they're like, get this thing out of here. So we find it at the house of Abinadab, Abinadab was the high priest. It is Abinadab. Abinadab is a Levite, so he's a priest, and his sons are priests, and that's why they're in charge of moving the ark. We see that consistently with David. Anyone who's moving the ark is a Levite. He never has anyone who isn't a Levite in charge of moving the ark. Now, of course, this is when Uzziah reaches out, touches the ark when the cart, to keep it from falling over on the cart, because it's not being transported the right way, and he gets struck dead. So they leave. They stop trying to move the cart. They leave it in a place of Obed-Edom. And then, as some time passes, we see in verse 12, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom from the city of David I jump back. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, when he and all of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. I don't know particularly, other than that there's a lot of symbolism in the numbers, and I would have to look back on somebody explaining the numbers of the tabernacle to see what 6 was. 6 the number for man? Something like that. 7 was the number for heaven. And I think man was 3. No, God was 3. There's some significance to the numbers, but it's not something I remember off the top of my head. But there's a lot of, they'll say that this number represents this thing, that number represents that thing. So it's like when you see 70, 70 doesn't really mean 70, 70 means hundreds. Okay.
Signifies a deliberate, reverent, and worshipful approach to God's presence, where King David offers sacrifices every 6 paces, representing a balance between human effort and by grace.
Okay. Sounds close enough.
So you were right.
All right. It is, and a lot of time they'll do that with symbology, which, when we don't have Jewish minds, isn't always immediately obvious to us. But like 70 is the easy one because that's the complete number. So, what's the first translation of the Bible is the Septuagint, which means the 70, which means it was more like 78 people, but they're just saying it's a complete number. All right. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of the Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their home. So this is a huge event. People are turning out by the thousands for the moving of the Ark of the Covenant here. We saw that David has put the Levites in charge of this move. Even the first move that failed when they were putting it on the cart, well, he had left that up to the Levites to figure out, and they're the ones who had done that. So that was Uzziah, and that didn't work. But then we see the second time the Levites are carrying the ark, which is the correct way. If you don't know this part, there were poles that would extend from the ends of the ark, and so you'd have multiple people would hold up a pole, and you'd have like 4 to 6 people carry the ark that way, which then is much more adaptable to uneven terrain because it's just people walking at that point. It says the house of a Levite. That's probably more like an estate, a pretty big area that was with Abinadab. The Levite that it mentioned, his name was Abinadab. This is where the ark stopped from the first move before it came to Jerusalem. His story doesn't quite end there, and I thought this was interesting to note. He was later assigned to the temple as a gatekeeper and musician. So, of course, the temple isn't going to be built until Solomon. But this man who took care of the ark was thought of enough that even generations later, he's being thought of, he's being taken care of, and he's even getting mentioned again in the Bible. So now we see Jerusalem becoming the center both of worship and the capital of the state. This was already David's capital. Now he brings the ark here, which means this is going to be the center of worship. And this is just kind of a nice big map to try and lay this out. I'm not going to necessarily go through all of it, but the Philistines had taken it all over the place, and then it starts finding its way back to Jerusalem, or to Jerusalem, I should say, because it's never been there before. So let's take a look at David's victories, because he's going to be pretty much constantly at war during the time of his reign. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. He took Metheg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. King David dedicated all these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. So here we get a nice list in chapter 8. Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and Amalek. He dedicated the plunder taken from Hadazar of Rehob and king of Zobah. When this says Edom, Edom, of course, as a people, they're the descendants of Esau, who should not be at war with Israel. They are not supposed to do that. But there is a footnote on this that it seems to be the land of Edom. So, if you remember from way back when we were talking about this, that's a mixed land. It's not just the descendants of Esau. There were already people there, and it just kind of all blends together. We don't really see it distinct. So there were some hostile people to Israel here. But verse 12 gives us that nice list of all of the people that Israel was at war with. So Edom and Moab, they're generations older than Israel. They start much closer to Abraham than Israel did. So they've had more time to build up their population. They've been in these areas for much longer. The Ammonites, of course, were a very major factor. We don't see the Canaanites at this point. They're done. The Canaanites have been defeated. So that was predominantly under Saul. The Philistines, they of course have absorbed some of the Canaanites because Goliath was a Canaanite. He was there before the Philistines. So there's definitely an appearance that the Philistines became absorbed. Canaanites became absorbed by the Philistines. Amalek was that tribe that was a lot of city-states. And Zobah was the other land that's mentioned here. So David's expanding the borders of Israel in a big way. One of the places it seems to indicate that he's captured Gath, the major fortress city of the Philistines. He's moved out of the hills. This map's got a little bit of terrain indication on it to kind of show you these are the hills, and then we're getting down into plains here as they go to war against the Philistines. There's a troubled history with Moab. They get along at some times, other times they're not getting along. There's a lot of hot and cold with Moab, but at this point, David is subduing them. And he really, well, I try to think of a word because I got a specific word stuck in my head and that's the wrong word. 2 out of 3 Moabites are killed here. So it's a massive reduction of that people. And David's going to make sure they're not a threat again, at least not anytime soon. So it is a huge reduction in their population. They are subdued, and they are now subordinate to Israel from here on for a time. And Moab would be over here on the other side of the Dead Sea. There's a lot of movement to the south. There's even some movement to the north here under David. Israel is now a regional power, to say the least. They're not going to go fight wars in Europe. They're not a global power, but they're a regional power. They are a major player here. They're possibly one of the more stable ones that exists in this area because, again, there's still a lot of nomadic people. There's a lot of independent kingdom city-states that sometimes work together because, hey, we got some connections back there, but I don't trust you too much. There's a lot of that kind of thing in the world. Egypt's pretty stable over here, but Israel is becoming that kind of level. This point made a lot more sense to me when I wrote it down. Tau, the king of Hamath. This is an area that gets mentioned briefly, but there's a contemporaneous writing here that they found, an inscription that says, I am Taitea, the hero, king of Palestine. I can't remember who exactly that had to do with, but it was one of the figures that gets mentioned in this chapter. And so basically, there's a contemporary writing that seems to indicate the same person who is talked about in the Bible. So forgive me for not remembering who exactly he was, because it wasn't King David or anyone like that, but it's one of the people that they interacted with. There is an inscription that seems to reference them. I should have made my note better than that. Chapter 10, we see the Ammonites. When the Ammonites realized they had become obnoxious to David, they hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rahab and Zobah, as well as the king of Maacah, with 1,000 men, and also 12,000 men from Tob. Oh, that starts making more sense, but we just had that foot on the wrong place. Upon hearing this, David sent Joab with the entire army of fighting men. David had sent diplomats to the Ammonites. The Ammonites rejected and insulted the diplomats, which is not a thing you do with people you want to be at peace with. The Ammonites were descended from Lot. This is Ammon, which we see over here towards the south of this map. The Arameans were from the desert of Aram. They're possibly a nomadic people. This was a high point for Aram, which is post-Bronze Age and before the Assyrian Empire. We saw the Assyrian Empire still like 100 years away. For Aram, this is kind of about as strong as they ever get. Huge amounts of victories we just saw piled up for David. We just saw a lot of winning on all sides. This should be the high point of his career. This is a lot accomplished. This is a lot that you should be able to rejoice over. And what happens right at this time is Bathsheba. So I don't think I need to explain that story in any detail. I think everybody gets it. But I wanted to point out the context that it happens in. It is right after all of these amazing victories have been piled up for Israel. That's when it happens. That's going to have consequences, and part of it's going to be one of David's own sons rebelling against him, Absalom. We see in verse 14, David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin to us and put the city to the sword." So now David is going to flee from Jerusalem, the city he had captured not that long ago, although I say that, we're probably talking over a generation at this point. Absalom is his oldest son, who has now staged a coup and is taking over the kingdom. The priests, though, they're on the side of David, to the point that they bring the Ark of the Covenant with David. And they move to the edge of the Israel in an area that we've seen before. So this is what we had to talk about Mahanaim, however that's pronounced. This is kind of a fortress area. It's where we saw Jacob and Esau. This was a very historic place, but this is sitting on the edge of Israel where the eastern tribes are. So this is pretty far removed. And I think we can leave the Queen of Sheba till next week. So we saw pretty much all we're going to see out of life of King David. Of course, he will go back to Jerusalem, and there he will eventually name his son Solomon as his successor. And we'll talk about Solomon in his lifetime next week.